My name is Lauren Miller, and at my father's 60th birthday gathering, my sister's kid stood up in front of the entire family, lifted his plastic cup toward me, and said I was nothing more than the pathetic aunt who tries to buy affection. For a moment, everything froze. Then the room burst into laughter. My sister pressed a hand to her mouth as if stunned, but she laughed harder than anyone. My parents stayed silent. A few cousins glanced my way, then quickly looked off like they wanted no part of it. I remained there holding a plate of lukewarm chicken, feeling every laugh hit me like it had been rehearsed. My nephew didn't stop. He joked about how I always arrive with presents, how I toss cash at people because I'm alone, how I never built a family of my own so I was basically renting one. Someone actually applauded. Another voice said, "He's just being honest." I could have shouted. I could have reminded them who was covering his rent, his tuition, and half the expenses keeping this family steady. Instead, I placed my plate down, smoothed my dress, and walked out of that church hall without saying a word of goodbye. On the drive back, my phone lit up with messages saying I was overly sensitive and couldn't handle a joke. I ignored every single one. I just kept looping one thought in my mind again and again. If they truly believe I'm just the sad aunt who buys love, they're about to see what happens when I stop buying. If you've ever been mocked by your own family for the help you give them, stay with me, hit subscribe, stick around till the end, and I'll show you exactly what happened when I finally treated them the way they treated me. Long before anything blew up, my life was already revolving around duties no one else wanted to shoulder. I didn't see the change right away. It crept in slowly, quietly, like a chill slipping under a closed door until suddenly the entire room feels cold. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where people worked non-stop but never seemed to get ahead. My parents were practical to the core. My mom cutting coupons every Sunday morning. My dad fixing things until they finally gave out for good. Money was always discussed in fragments. You learned young to sense the tension before anyone admitted a bill was late. When I left for college, I believed distance would ease that weight. I pictured myself entering a life where power bills and medical write-offs weren't constant worries. But responsibility doesn't disappear just because you change zip codes. It trails you, matures with you. And when you're the one who gets out, it waits on your shoulder for the chance to climb back on. After graduating, I moved into the city, rented a tiny place, and buried myself in my job. Every promotion felt like proof I was finally creating something solid. I didn't realize that stability is what you become to everyone else first. The calls from home came little by little. My mom mentioning the car needed work. My dad hinting insurance wouldn't cover a new medication. Small issues at first, almost murmured like speaking up too much would make them a burden. I sent what I could, then I sent more. Eventually, I stopped checking if I could afford it. I just sent the money. Thankful the problem wasn't worse. Thankful I had enough. My older sister, Megan Parker, lived a life that never followed a straight path. She had always been impulsive. The first to fall hard, the first to marry, the first to have a child, and the first to feel crushed by it all. Her son, Ethan Parker, grew up inside that disorder, comforted by knowing someone else would always step in and hold things together when Megan couldn't. Megan Parker and I were never particularly close. Still, we shared an unspoken understanding that family takes the hit when life comes down too hard, and life came down on her often. A maxed-out credit card, a medical invoice she claimed slipped her mind, an unexpected job loss. Each emergency showed up like a sudden gust, and I'd brace the door before it slammed. Sometimes I convinced myself I was just helping her stay above water. Other times I knew I was the only thing keeping her from going under. The years moved on like that. Me advancing in my career, them staying balanced on whatever support I sent their way. My parents' health became uncertain. Megan's finances cracked in the same familiar patterns. I turned into the safety net, pulled tight but never snapping because I refused to let myself fail. It felt simpler to be reliable than to watch everything fall apart without me. When Ethan Parker reached college age, Megan argued he deserved a real opportunity. I agreed. He was bright, charming, the kind of kid who could thrive with the right structure. But structure costs money, and Megan couldn't get student loans without a co-signer. My parents were unable to help. That left me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the loan paperwork, page after page of fine print outlining years of payments and interest. Signing meant binding myself to his future in ways he might never grasp. Not signing meant leaving him stuck with the same narrow options we'd all grown up with. I signed. And it didn't end there. Tuition deadlines came faster than Megan could manage. Housing deposits were due before she'd even wrapped her head around the last expense. Ethan needed a place close to campus, textbooks priced like luxury goods, groceries that vanished faster than expected. Every new cost made its way to me. And because I still believed I was helping someone move forward instead of teaching them to lean, I kept saying yes. There's a strange thing that happens when you become the dependable one. People stop recognizing the effort behind that dependability. They stop noticing the extra hours you work or the things you give up to keep everything running. All they see is the hand that keeps reaching out. They assume it will always be there. By the time Ethan settled into his off-campus apartment, half of his life was tied to my name, his loans, his housing, his ability to stay enrolled. Megan thanked me once, her voice sounding more relieved than appreciative. My parents said I was just doing what family does, and I told myself that was enough. But beneath it all, something quiet was shifting. Not in them, in me. A low-level exhaustion. The feeling that I was carrying more weight than I should. The awareness that I'd built an entire framework beneath people who rarely bothered to look down and notice it. I didn't realize it then, but every transfer, every signature, every obligation I absorbed was forming the backbone of a lesson they would learn the hard way. And eventually, the moment would arrive when I stepped aside and let them stand on their own for the first time. There's a point after humiliation when your mind stops replaying what happened and starts reshaping itself into something sharper. That change came to me the following morning. Not as rage, but as a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The understanding that I'd been holding up an entire structure no one else even tried to examine. Once you truly see something for what it is, you can't unsee it. I sat at my kitchen counter with a mug of lukewarm coffee, letting the silence settle around me. It felt like standing on the edge of a decision I'd been avoiding far too long. My laptop rested unopened beside me, the cursor waiting on the screen like an invitation. There's a certain power in not reacting right away, in letting everything settle before choosing your next move. I wanted what I did next to be deliberate, not impulsive, because impulsive choices are easy to excuse. Deliberate ones cannot. When I finally opened my laptop, I took my time. I moved through folders, emails, saved files, tracing every digital thread that tied me to responsibilities I hadn't realized had hardened into permanent fixtures. I began with the largest one, housing. Ethan Parker's apartment existed only because my financial standing was attached to it. Without that support, the walls around him were standing on borrowed time. I opened the lease agreement and read it carefully, line by line, not because I needed clarification, but because I wanted to fully face what I had allowed. My name appeared on every page. Responsible party, guarantor, emergency contact. It felt like staring at a diagram showing how thoroughly I had stitched myself into someone else's life. I located the housing office email and composed a message. I didn't dress it up. I didn't justify myself. I simply stated that I would no longer be financially responsible for the unit and asked for instructions to end my involvement. The words looked severe on the screen, almost unfamiliar, as if they had been written by someone steadier than I had been before. The second I pressed send, something inside me loosened. Then I moved on to tuition payments. I scrolled through the automatic withdrawals that pulled money without requiring my attention. The regularity of those deductions had become so routine that I'd forgotten they were a choice. It felt odd, even liberating, to click disable. A small confirmation window appeared asking if I was certain. I didn't pause. The window vanished and the page refreshed, empty where the schedule had been. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. It wasn't victory. It wasn't retaliation. It was a quiet reclaiming. The first intentional move toward letting them live without the padding I had built beneath them. Notifications began almost right away. Not from my family. Those would come later, but from the systems I had just changed. Housing confirmed my request and noted that an eligibility review would be initiated. The college portal flagged the account as pending, a word heavy with consequences none of them were ready to face. I closed each tab one at a time, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders with every click. For years, I had told myself I had no alternative, that stepping back meant deserting them. Now I understood the truth. They were never standing. They were leaning, and I had allowed it. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving through my home like someone rediscovering it. I folded clothes, watered plants, wiped counters. Ordinary tasks that felt grounding. My phone stayed face down on the couch, silent. I didn't want to see messages yet, but I knew they were on their way. When the sun sank lower, stretching long shadows across the living room, I finally picked up my phone. Dozens of alerts lit up the screen. System notices from housing. Financial updates from the tuition portal. Nothing personal yet, just the administrative consequences of my absence spreading outward, announcing the change before I did. I set the phone down again. I didn't want to wait for the emotional aftermath. Instead, I stepped onto my balcony. The air was cool, steady, indifferent, everything my family was not. I rested against the railing and allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to stop softening every impact that hit them. What would they do without the safety net they assumed would always appear? They were about to learn. Later that night, I turned my laptop back on, not out of hesitation, but to be sure I hadn't overlooked anything. I reviewed every account tied to my finances, every recurring charge connected to someone else's needs. With each cancellation, another piece of my life came back to me. It struck me how quietly these obligations had latched on, how easily care turns into labor when no one else steps forward to share it. By the time I shut my laptop for the second time, the room felt altered, lighter, like I had finally stopped hauling something heavy behind me. I knew the quiet wouldn't last. Families like mine rarely notice the support you provide, but they notice immediately when it's gone. The financial systems were already recalibrating around my absence. The emotional ones would trail behind soon enough. For the moment, though, there was calm, a strange and unfamiliar kind, the kind that comes from choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was only the start. The stillness before the first wave reached them. And it didn't take long. It was almost unsettling how fast my silence turned into noise on their end. Not the sound of genuine concern, but the frantic scrambling people make when the ground shifts beneath them and they can't tell why. The first ripple came mid-morning. One vibration, then another, then a constant pulse, like my phone had been jolted awake. I didn't grab it right away. There's a quiet strength in deciding exactly when to look at the things that once ruled you. When I finally picked it up, the screen glowed with the kind of urgency people reserve for emergencies they created themselves. Megan Parker's messages dominated the screen. Her words felt rushed, breathless, clipped fragments loaded with panic and outrage. She didn't ask what was happening. She demanded explanations. She insisted something had to be wrong with the payment system, that I needed to fix it before it spiraled, as if a technical glitch had suddenly made life unfair. The entitlement was so familiar it almost made me smile. Then came Ethan Parker's alerts, each one vibrating with the confidence of someone who had never learned the worth of what he was given. His tone lurched between disbelief and accusation. He wrote like the universe had personally wronged him, like the disruption in his life couldn't possibly be connected to his own actions. There was something raw in his messages, the kind of unfiltered frustration that only surfaces when someone is accustomed to every safety net catching them. My parents' texts came last, not gentler, just wrapped to seem that way. My mom chose her words carefully, the kind meant to sound calming while still applying pressure. My dad kept his messages short and restrained, almost transactional, as if removing emotion would make the situation more acceptable. Both framed their concern around family obligation. Neither acknowledged the imbalance that had been building for years. I set the phone down. For a long while, I stood in the center of my living room, letting their messages linger in the air like a chorus demanding response. There was a time I would have rushed to fix it all, guilt racing ahead of reason. Not anymore. There's a difference between being needed and being used, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. As the day wore on, their anxiety intensified. Megan called again and again. The ringing felt almost theatrical, like each call was meant to broadcast her irritation more than her fear. Ethan doubled down on his texts, stacking blame on top of self-pity. My parents slid into their familiar routine, guilt layered with logic, concern wrapped tightly around expectation. I ignored every bit of it. By afternoon, another shift came, sharp and clearly rehearsed. Megan changed her approach. She wrote as if she were above the disorder, as if she alone were holding the family upright while I had suddenly destabilized everything. She painted a version of events where I was reckless, emotional, unreliable, the very qualities she had embodied for years. It was almost admirable how quickly she rewrote the story, crowning herself the responsible one. I recognized the move immediately. When people lose the pedestal they built on someone else's effort, they claw for anything to restore it, but I wasn't stepping back down. I had stepped away. 2 days later, the messages shifted tone again. Not gentler, just more tactical. Megan Parker suggested we clear the air, wording it like an offer instead of an order. She proposed brunch, neutral territory. Just immediate family, she said, a chance to talk like adults. Everything about it felt engineered. Still, curiosity has its own gravity. Not toward making peace, toward gaining clarity. I wanted to see how they behaved when they couldn't hide behind numbers. So I agreed. On Sunday, I showed up at the small cafe with cheerful photos of breakfast skillets covering every wall. The second I walked in, I knew there was nothing neutral about it. Megan Parker wasn't alone. My parents sat stiffly at the end of the booth, hands folded as if bracing for impact. And beside them, stretched out with the ease of someone who believed himself untouchable, was Ethan Parker. The look on his face wasn't regret. It wasn't confusion. It was annoyance. Like I'd inconvenienced him by forcing him to face consequences he never thought would arrive. For a brief moment, everything inside me went quiet. Then something shifted. Not toward forgiveness but toward understanding. This was never meant to be a discussion. It was an ambush dressed up as concern. A performance designed to push me back into the role they preferred. Dependable, silent, absorbent. I didn't sit. I didn't speak. I simply turned and walked out the same way I had walked out of that church hall days earlier. This time there was no sting, no embarrassment, only certainty. Behind me I heard chairs scrape, someone calling my name, the clink of silverware sliding across the table. I kept going. The air outside felt different, cleaner, lighter, like stepping out of a smoke-filled room I hadn't realized I was suffocating in until it cleared. Families often lean on rituals to reset order. A brunch, a gathering, a talk. But rituals only work when the people involved want change. They didn't. And I was done confusing their panic with love. The quiet after the brunch ambush didn't last. It never does when people who depend on you realize the leash they've been pulling no longer reaches. The shift started subtly, like a temperature drop before a storm, then surged into something sharp enough to rattle the calm I'd carved out for myself. It began the next morning, long before sunrise, while most of the city was still wrapped in darkness. Notifications stacked across my phone one after another in rapid succession. Snorts. I didn't need to open them to know the mood had turned. Panic always comes first. Anger follows. This time the messages dropped the pretense of concern. They arrived sharpened, intentional, weighted with resentment that had clearly been waiting for its chance. Megan Parker's words read like someone finally removing a mask she'd worn for years. Accusations coded in self-righteous certainty. Snorts. Framed my silence as hostility and my boundaries as betrayal, stressing how much strain I was placing on the family. Every line carried the assumption that restoring balance was my responsibility. A balance she believed belonged to her. Then came the next wave. My parents' attempts at moral pressure. Their messages cast me as the disruptor, the force destabilizing an otherwise functional family. It was staggering how easily they erased the years I'd spent holding everything together. My absence was the only thing they could see. They reacted as if I'd knocked over something they built, not something I'd been carrying. I let their words sit on the screen untouched. There are moments when silence is defiance, but in times like this, it's simply truth. No explanation could reshape the past into something they were willing to face. It was early afternoon when Ethan Parker's presence surfaced again, not through words, but through consequences he could no longer avoid. My call log filled with missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The consistency told me they weren't random. They were coming from offices, advisors, administrative desks. Each one signaled that systems outside my family had already begun adjusting to the changes I'd set in motion. Ethan Parker's support framework was starting to collapse inward, and he was scrambling, unsure how to move through a world without the cushioning he'd always assumed would be there. I didn't listen to a single voicemail. Desperation has a way of dragging people back into roles they're trying to leave behind. I wasn't allowing that. Instead, I spent the afternoon moving through my day with intention, teaching myself how to exist without bracing for the next emergency call. I made lunch, stood by the window as the light shifted across the room, and let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in years. Distance. Not the bitter, angry kind, just the space that forms when you stop reshaping yourself around other people's demands. By evening, a new message came through, long, rambling, soaked in the kind of personal attack people resort to when logic abandons them. The source didn't surprise me. Neither did the tone, but one line cut deeper than the rest. Not because it was true, but because it exposed what they'd been thinking long before the family gathering. He accused me of being self-centered, of living a life rooted in loneliness, of clinging to achievement because I had nothing else. It was startling how fast entitlement curdled into cruelty. How easily people lash out when the person supporting them stops extending a hand. Yet as I read it, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel hurt. I felt certain. There's a moment when cruelty stops feeling personal and starts sounding like a confession. His words didn't define me. They revealed who he had always been beneath the surface. Ungrateful, protected, convinced the world owed him comfort. That realization steadied me. I closed the message without replying and reached for my laptop. If the storm was building, I wouldn't be caught unprepared. The next steps appeared with surprising clarity, almost clinical. I logged into the financial accounts connected to my family, reviewing each automatic payment, each loan guarantee, each recurring expense I'd forgotten I was even covering. The numbers mapped obligations I'd stopped seeing as choices. With steady hands, I began ending them one by one, not out of bitterness but out of necessity. There was a strange calm in the precision. The credit line linked to Megan Parker's home maintenance fund was closed. The monthly support I'd been sending my parents was shut off. The emergency account Ethan had access to was locked. It was astonishing how many threads needed cutting, like trimming old strands from a tapestry that had grown too heavy to carry. When the final confirmation email landed in my inbox, a wave of clarity passed through me. I'd spent years cushioning their stumbles, repairing gaps they refused to acknowledge. Now for the first time the weight wasn't mine. I stepped onto the balcony, letting the night air cool the heat that had built inside me all day. Below, the city moved forward, unaware of the fracture widening inside my family. It was humbling in an odd way, how small personal storms looked against a skyline of quietly glowing windows. Somewhere in that stillness I understood something essential. Their anger wasn't evidence that I'd done wrong. It was proof I'd finally done something they could no longer control. The consequences they faced weren't punishments. They were simply responsibility returning to where it belonged. And for the first time I felt ready for whatever came next. There's a specific kind of silence that follows when people run out of every tactic they know. Denial, anger, guilt, manipulation, and the slow realization that none of it was working. That silence showed up a few days after I cut the final financial cord. It wasn't calm or reflective, but dense, like the pressure in the air right before something gives way. I noticed the change first through what was missing. The phone that used to buzz constantly sat still on my table, unmoving like it was holding its breath. I didn't trust the quiet. People don't transform overnight. They regroup. They pause. They search for another way in. And I knew my family well enough to understand that their silence wasn't acceptance. It was adjustment. By midday that quiet fractured. One email appeared in my inbox. It wasn't from anyone I knew, but from an administrative coordinator at a nearby community center. They explained they'd received an inquiry about urgent family assistance and wanted to confirm my involvement. The second I finished reading, everything fell into place. My family wasn't trying to clean up the mess they'd made. They were trying to hand it off. It was a strange, almost unreal feeling to watch them reroute responsibility without ever questioning why things had collapsed. They weren't searching for solutions. They were searching for replacements. Anyone or anything as long as it wasn't them. I deleted the email without replying. Later that afternoon, another wave reached me. A distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who never remembered my birthday but never missed family gossip, sent a message packed with concern that barely concealed its real intent. Snorts. My family had started spreading a version of events, one that cast themselves as victims of a sudden crisis and me as the cause. It wasn't shocking. When people lose access, they compensate by rewriting the narrative. Their story painted me as stubborn and impulsive, a woman ruled by emotion, a daughter who had abandoned her duties. What they conveniently left out were the years of quiet support, the endless sacrifices, the emotional weight no one ever recognized. Selective memory was a skill they'd perfected long before this moment. The message didn't upset me. What stood out was how predictable it all felt. How quickly dysfunction turns into theater when the audience changes. As evening settled in, I stepped onto my balcony. The sky was darkening, headlights tracing long, continuous lines along the street below. I watched strangers move through their lives with a lightness I hadn't known in years. Somewhere in that stillness, a question surfaced. Why had I ever believed their chaos was mine to carry? The calm didn't last. Around sunset, the building's security desk called to let me know someone had tried to enter without authorization. They hadn't made it past the lobby, but the description was unmistakable. My father. He'd shown up without warning, persistent and unprepared, relying on the assumption that he could simply appear and I'd slip back into my role. The guard said he eventually left, irritated but composed. That didn't comfort me. My father had always worn calm like a mask, hiding the urgency underneath. His visit wasn't about mending anything. It was about control. I waited for panic to surface, but it never did. What I felt instead was steadier. Resolve. That night, I widened the distance between us. I disabled shared accounts I'd forgotten were still active. Removed my information from directories I hadn't checked in years. Updated systems that still listed me as an emergency contact. Each change felt like tightening the edges of a boundary that had been unraveling since the moment I learned to put everyone else first. The next afternoon brought a different kind of disturbance. A package. No return address. No handwriting. Just a plain cardboard box sitting on my doorstep like a question waiting for an answer. I hesitated before opening it, already bracing myself. Inside were fragments of my past, old birthday cards, thank you notes, small mementos I'd given Ethan Parker over the years. They were sent back carelessly, shoved together as if they were junk someone wanted gone without being noticed. No explanation, no apology, just a box of abandoned history left in my hallway. For a moment I stood there completely still, not wounded, just alert. This was not reconciliation. This was retaliation. When people lose access to you, they search for ways to provoke you. They try to remind you of the role they assigned you in the structure they built. But the box did something they never expected. It brought everything into focus. I picked up each item, placed it back inside, and taped the box shut with intentional care. Then I carried it straight to the donation center down my street. I didn't linger. I didn't second-guess myself. I handed it over and felt something inside me finally let go, the last thread snapping clean. That evening, as the light softened across my living room, I realized how far I had come from the woman who once answered every call, solved every issue, absorbed every careless remark. The distance between who I had been and who I was now felt wide but not empty. For the first time, the quiet around me didn't feel heavy. It felt deserved. They wanted a version of me who would bend until she broke. She was gone. And I wasn't finished walking away. There comes a moment when the world stops trembling and the dust settles, revealing what remains after everything falls apart. That moment arrived quietly, not with another message or a knock, but in the stillness of a morning that felt strangely light. It was the first time I sensed the chaos orbiting my family had turned inward, closing around them instead of reaching for me. The first sign arrived through a brief notice forwarded by my building office. A representative from the student aid department had tried to confirm financial responsibility for Ethan Parker's account and received no response from my family. Without backing, his enrollment took a sharp downward turn. The attached file outlined withdrawal procedures and loss of eligibility. I didn't open it. It was no longer my story. Whatever consequences followed belonged to him now. Later that week, a neighbor mentioned seeing someone pacing outside the building, agitated and restless. She described a young man with slumped shoulders clutching something tightly. I didn't need a name to know who it was. The image stayed with me longer than I expected, not from guilt but understanding. Some lessons require discomfort. Some truths only form when the safety net vanishes. My parents stayed silent. Not the sharp, confrontational silence from before, but something hollow and resigned, the kind that settles in when people realize the tools they relied on no longer work. Their absence felt unfamiliar. For so long, my life had been shaped by reacting to their needs, expectations, and disappointments. Now that distance felt like an empty room I no longer felt compelled to fill. Megan Parker's unraveling reached me through indirect paths, scattered comments from relatives, passing remarks from acquaintances, whispers moving through the loose network of people drawn to family tension. Her polished exterior had started to fracture. Without my financial cushion propping up the household she managed so carefully, responsibilities stacked up faster than she could deflect them. Bills surfaced. Repairs stalled. Obligations she once ignored demanded attention. It was the first time she had been forced to stand without the unseen scaffolding she assumed would always exist. None of it brought me satisfaction. It simply confirmed the truth I had avoided for years. People rarely value foundations they never realize they are standing on. One afternoon, as the pale winter light spread across my living room, I opened a blank notebook, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote down the names of the people I had been supporting, not from bitterness but from clarity. Seeing the list on paper made the weight tangible, visible, and next to each name I wrote one quiet sentence, not mine to carry anymore. A strange calm moved through me. In the evenings I started taking long walks around my neighborhood. The streets felt different, steady, uncomplicated. For years, every quiet moment had been interrupted by an obligation pulling me back into a life I hadn't chosen. Now the silence felt deserved. I began traveling again, not to run away but to grow, visiting places I had delayed for years because someone else always needed me more. Through all of it, my phone stayed silent. No apologies, no attempts to mend things, no effort to rebuild. That silence confirmed what I had always sensed. They never wanted me, only what I gave. Losing access wasn't just an inconvenience for them. It forced them to face the reality they had shaped through entitlement and avoidance. Strangely, the only genuine note came from a distant relative who reached out with a message that carried no request, only reflection. She wrote about how families often confuse dependence with love, and how the people we help the most can become the ones who feel most entitled. Her words didn't fix anything, but they offered a perspective untouched by control. As days turned into weeks, I felt something shift inside me. I no longer replayed the moment in the church hall, the laughter spreading across faces I once trusted. The sting faded, not because it mattered less, but because I understood that moment didn't shatter me. It exposed them. One evening, after returning from a short trip, a final envelope waited in my mailbox. There was no handwriting, nothing to suggest who sent it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a faint crease down the center, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Its emptiness said everything their words never had. I placed it in a drawer and closed it softly. What followed was a clean, steady quiet, not loneliness, just space. Space that had been denied to me for years. Space I could finally fill with something of my own choosing. In that quiet, everything settled into place. I didn't walk away from a family. I walked away from a pattern. A pattern of taking responsibility for people who refused it. A pattern of accepting disrespect disguised as humor. A pattern of pouring myself into gaps they created and then blamed me for not filling fast enough. Walking away wasn't cruelty. It was survival. If this story offers anything worth keeping, it's this. Peace doesn't come when others change. It comes when you stop shrinking yourself to fit the role they built for their comfort. You can love from a distance. You can care without losing yourself. And you are allowed to walk away from anyone who only values the version of you that benefits them. I didn't lose a family. I reclaimed my life.